Like I said, shrinkage of concrete is a given. It's an inherent part of the chemical reaction. Now, since this is a given and since it's very predictable, we've come up with some strategies to manage this cracking. And these strategies run the gamut from simple things like actually just letting it crack or forcing it to crack at a location that we pick, all the way to more advanced strategies like using special chemical admixtures or pre-stressing the concrete. Now, the use of chemical admixtures to control shrinkage cracking has had some documented success, but it does require some pretty careful planning, some special techniques, and the use of a type of admixture that's referred to as a shrinkage compensating admixture. Or we can use shrinkage compensating cement that has properties similar to that chemical admixture. Now, one issue here is that this costs some money, and it might not be the most cost-effective method of managing the cracking in many cases. The other issue is that these products don't really stop shrinkage. So as their name sort of implies, they actually attempt to compensate for it. The way these things work is by actually causing the concrete to expand shortly after the initial set to compensate for the shrinkage that we know is going to happen after that. Now, in order to really make this work, the concrete's got to be somewhat contained as it expands and squeezes itself together so that its volume remains unchanged when it shrinks later. So again, this exists, but its use has really been restricted to mostly some real large warehouse floors or maybe a few structures like parking garages on a limited basis. And again, a lot of this comes down to knowledge and economics. Another way to manage this type of cracking in these floors is to just let it happen, but force it to crack where we want it to crack. The way we do this is by tooling or cutting joints in the concrete at predetermined locations. Now, to be effective, these joints need to be cut early, before much of the shrinkage starts, and these joints are called control joints. Now, by cutting or tooling these joints deep enough, we actually create a weakened plane at that location with the idea that as the concrete shrinks, it'll then crack at these weakened locations. You want to put enough of these in and space them so that the only shrinkage cracking occurs at these joints. This technique is used in unreinforced concrete, and it's very common in slab-on-ground construction. Sidewalks, a great example, where you see joints tooled every 5 feet. As the concrete shrinks, it cracks inside these joints and not between them, so they're not as noticeable and don't appear to be a defect, even though the cracks are still there. Another common method of dealing with shrinkage is by adding rebar, just like we do to reinforce against bending. But in this view, bending and shrinkage are really still the same. They both generate tensile stresses in the concrete. What we have to do to prevent the cracking in this case is add rebar when we calculate that the tensile stresses due to the concrete shrinkage are going to exceed the concrete's tensile strength. Like I said earlier, sometimes the reinforcing needed to make the structure strong enough is also enough to reinforce against shrinkage cracking. Sometimes in these structures, though, we need to add some rebar in locations where it wouldn't be needed to reinforce against bending. This is oftentimes called temperature and shrinkage reinforcing. It's there to reinforce against just the cracking caused by volume changes, and that includes that initial shrinkage as well as any shrinkage that might occur later on as the concrete volume changes slightly due to temperature fluctuations. In these cases, the concrete's not going to bend. It's just going to pull straight apart. And instead of locating my rebar in the upper or lower portions of the concrete, I would now expect it to be located in the middle portion of the concrete. At this point, though, I probably better mention one of the limitations of rebar in these conditions. So far, I've been saying that we're trying to reinforce against cracking, but really we're actually reinforcing to control crack widths. Even using rebar, the concrete's going to crack because it takes so little movement to pull it apart and generate that little hairline crack. The strategy here is to use enough rebar to limit those crack widths so they don't open up. I want them to stay closed or remain that little narrow hairline crack. When I keep the crack closed, or at least limit the amount that it opens, not only do I have rebar spanning across that crack and strengthening the concrete, I also maintain what we call the aggregate interlock. So picture a jagged crack going through the depth of a slab. Because I have all these rocks or large aggregate pieces distributed through the mix, that crack doesn't run straight. It's jagged and it goes around those rocks. If I keep the crack width really tight, those aggregates will stay somewhat locked together to prevent those two halves from moving up and down relative to each other. The shrinkage is going to occur, and either of these techniques, placing control joints or adding temperature and reinforcing steel, just involve letting it crack while it shrinks, but managing locations and crack widths. Let's continue. We're going to take a look at a different form of concrete reinforcing that handles cracking in a little bit different manner.